All right, everyone. Welcome to the Cincinnati Observatory. We'll go ahead and get started. Thank you for joining us for our first of our space ethics series starting tonight. We have two more of these in the next two Tuesdays. So if you want to join us for those as well, those are available for registration. I know some of you are already registered for all three, but excited to have you guys here. Thank you for sitting at tables. For those of you who are typical class goers, you're like, tables, what's going on? We are going to play a game together here kind of towards the beginning, so this will help facilitate that. But if at any point you want to like turn your chair like you have, like great, because most of it is going to be facing this way, though there's still going to be discussion. You'll be talking to the folks at your table as well, so it's going to be a little bit of both, but definitely get comfortable. I just kept this set up from our summer camp because it's conducive for specifically the game that we're going to play together. So just sort of keep that in mind. Just make yourself comfortable. That's going to be what's most important. So today we're talking all about space ethics. And to give you some background of who I am and why I would be teaching this class, typically our classes are taught by our PhD astronomer, but he had to go to Florida. Suspicious. But I also really love talking about space ethics. Is actually a course that I developed for Thomas More University, where I also teach. But I do work here full-time as program educator, and everyone relax, I have a master's degree. So we're going to be okay today talking all about space ethics together, kind of talking about some of the stuff that, of course, our lovely astronomer, Dr. West, typically talks about, but just from a different perspective. And that's why I like teaching this course. It's a very sort of shortened, no homework version of the course that I do for Thomas More, which you're welcome. I thought about homework and I was like, I'm not doing that to them. But it's, I think, fun to kind of get our brains working in a kind of different, fun way. And it's a way for us to practice both talking about the things that we believe and think and hearing some of the perspectives from others, which I find we don't do enough of in this kind of way here. So excited to do that. So I like to start all of my space ethics courses with a question, just to see where our baseline is, where we're starting from. And I do that because we all come from different backgrounds. And yes, this is an observatory, and no, you didn't have to take a philosophy class like my Thomas More students, and they just picked the one that was not too early in the morning so they could sleep in. But here, I imagine we have a general interest in space. So we're probably coming from a slightly different baseline than my college students. But in this poll that I like to take at the beginning, it gives us an idea of kind of where we're all coming from in the ways that we think about the human's relationship with space. And this is going to be our guiding question for our whole course, but especially today as we go through. And it's the guiding principle in space ethics, which is the textbook that I use for the class that I, again, did not make any of you purchase or read. Though I did have one student last time, he's like, don't worry, I bought the book. And I was like, good for you, Al. So happy for Al doing some light reading. But this is really sort of the guiding force in this book, is to not necessarily answer this question, but have us think about this question: should we explore space? And help us get to some kind of personal conclusion on that with a way to articulate why we think that is. So that's really the sort of main question of the course. And so to start, I want to take that poll. But first, I'm going to see who this ominous shadow is out here. It's Mom. We're good. Okay. Making sure. Okay. So let's go ahead and take a poll. Raise your hand if you are on the perspective of, yes, let's do it. Let's leave planet Earth. Let's go explore space in a very general sense. You know, I'm not getting into particulars here, but just like a yes, we should do that. Okay. It's a good majority. Weirdly enough, a whole table who didn't raise their hand. That's interesting. All right, that'll be a fun conversation table over there. Okay, and then are the rest of us humans, or at least a majority of what we're doing should remain on Earth? The efforts in general should remain on Earth. Interesting. Okay, so a little bit different. I gave a version of this last night to our photo organization, and it was like almost unanimous, the first one. So, which I was not that surprised. But that's an interesting kind of place to start. So this, again, is a baseline more for you than it is for me, but it's just interesting to know kind of where you all stand. And what I hope to do by the end, we'll take another poll, again, not for me, but for you, right? After we have all these discussions, where are your perspectives maybe shifting, changing, or staying the same? Like maybe you're doubling down on your thinking, but you have more reasons to support your claim in, either way. So that's really what we're going to do here today is walk through some of these questions. Like I said, that space ethics textbook is sort of like the guiding text for what we're talking about and the ways that I'm approaching some of these questions. But I also have some accompanying texts that are, hello, welcome, that, again, not exactly space ethics. Do not go out and buy these. You do not need to do that. Highly would not recommend, actually. This one is not the best, but it has some basic terms for us. So we're also going to dive a little bit into environmental ethics. So what we're going to do is sort of use the perspectives in environmental ethics to walk through some issues with space ethics. So applied ethics is just a version of ethics that we have. So we can talk about ethics and how we apply it to different subjects. Environmental ethics is one of the topics that we're going to use as sort of a way to talk about ethics today. And medical ethics or bioethics is the other way. So again, don't buy these texts. These are slightly better than that other one. If you want any recommendations for texts to actually read, to dive through some of these topics, let me know. These are very textbooky and really give us some language, but they're not fun in sort of the I don't have a master's degree kind of way. So just keep that in mind. But if you would like to thumb through to see like, oh, you started talking about this, what else does it have to say about that? That's kind of why I brought those with me. So know that we're going to talk about space ethics, but use some of the language from these other texts really to help sort of form the conversation. I find when we talk about philosophy, it's not about persuading someone of your perspective. I'm not trying to tell you how you should answer this question. It's really just about you being able to figure out what you think about a topic, articulate that, critique your own perspective, and critique perspectives of others in a constructive way. And the best way to do that, I think, is to have a language for what you think and believe, right? Instead of just sort of being like, I just feel really strongly about this. It's like, okay, why? Like, what are your reasoning? And some language and having some basic language for us to talk about is, I think, a good place to start. Okay. Talking about some good places to start, we're going to start with the trolley problem. So those of you who are not familiar with the trolley problem, this is a thought experiment. Very famous in philosophy to have thought experiments. We can't just go around being like, is it right to kill someone? I don't know, let me try, right? Like that's not really how we figure things out in philosophy, the same way you figure things out in science, right? You test, you observe, things like that. In ethics, we do a lot of thought experiments. How would this work if we tried this or this or this? And it's all about just thinking through those possibilities. And the trolley problem is a version of that. Anyone who is familiar with the trolley problem, do you want to give it a go explaining kind of how it works? We also will get another explanation up here, but yes.
Yeah, so there's a trolley headed up running over 5 people. You can switch it to hit one person instead, but then you're the one to kill that person versus you're just bystander to 5 people.
So yeah, the thought experiment part of that is being like, what should I do in this scenario? This is a terrible scenario where there's this runaway trolley. You don't have any control over the circumstances of it being a runaway trolley, but you do have some control over what you do, your own decision making in this, and you have to make an ethical decision, and that's what makes this worth thinking about, worth discussing. And so what we're going to do today, I have a brief version of how the characters in the show called The Good Place, they're kind of working through some of these questions themselves. We're going to start with their kind of thoughts on this, and then I brought with me, because why not, there's an actual board game called The Trolley Problem, and we're also going to do the trolley problem together and talk a little bit about our reasoning behind this. This is going to help us get at our ethical intuition, which is basically like, what do I think on the bat, right? I'm I'm given an ethical dilemma. How do I sort of look at the issue at hand and try to come up with a solution? So being able to sort of play the game ourselves will help us start to figure out what that is. And that's going to help us with some of our conversations later. But first, let's just take a look at the trolley problem from The Good Place here.
No, this is a thought experiment, first introduced by British philosopher Philip Foot in 1967. You are driving a trolley when the brakes fail, and on the track ahead of you are 5 workmen that you will run over. Now, you can steer to another track, but on that track is one person you kill instead of 5. What do you do?
Do we know anything about the people? Like, is one of them an ex-boyfriend? Or that snooty girl from Rite Aid who was always silently judging my purchases? Like, yeah, Chippy, a baby Ruth and Raquel, I see the irony, keep us so like this.
You don't know any of them.
Okay, well then that's easy. It's tracks. Kill one person instead of 5. This is hard. It's very funny. Then I'll just James Franco's. I don't think I'll be a travel backwards. And Penguin Grotto, his garage, that old tricycle. Come on, say 5.
Good, but there's a lot of other versions. Like, what if you knew one of the people? Does that change the equation? Or what if you're not a partner, you're just a bystander? Or let's throw the trolley out altogether. Let's say you're a doctor and you can save 5 patients, but you have to kill one healthy person and use his organs to.
That's not the same thing.
Why not? It's still choosing to kill one person to save 5, isn't it? Michael, you may gone quiet. What do you think about all this?
Well, obviously the dilemma is clear. How do you kill all 6 people?
Oh, I did the thing. Yeah, say more about it.
People, good people.
Why is that so? What is it? Good.
So we don't want to be like Michael and just, choose killing all 6 people. Though we are about to play this game, and I will tell you, it's mostly choosing the least worst thing, right? That's what most ethics is, right? If it was like, should we do unicorns or rainbows? It's like, well, then that's great. It's all good choices. That is not what ethics is, because that's not what life is, right? So we'll be making some difficult decisions, but there are some sort of silly cards in here as well to help us with this. So in our trolley problem game, we have our tracks, which all of you have at your tables, and we have 3 different kinds of cards. So there's like an actual way to play this game, right? And it's like there's winners, losers. We're not going to go through the whole game. We're just going to go through a round at each table just to get your sort of ethical juices flowing. And then we'll have a little discussion and move on. So when we are doing our kind of one time doing the trolley problem, we're going to have good cards. So cards basically that tell us, I don't want to run over this track. So some examples like they talked about, she's like, well, what if I know the person? And she was like naming people she would want to run over. But it's like, what if it's your mom, right? Like that would be a good thing. This one is all the fish in the sea. So if you don't want to run over literally all the fish in the sea, don't ask me how they're on the trolley track and why they can't leave, but they're all on there, right? Like that's something we wouldn't want to run over. Then there's sort of the opposite of that. So this one is Kim Jong-un. So, depending your politics, you might be fine with running him over, right? So we have these sort of like good and evil cards that'll help sway which way you're thinking. And then what we're going to do, we're going to start with just these cards, have a little bit of a go, and then we're going to throw, halfway through the discussion, I'm going to throw a wrench in your plans, and that is I'm going to add a real stumper, a thinker, and that is a card that you're going to add to one of the cards that are existing on there that makes it maybe more appealing or less appealing, essentially, to run that person over to save them. So this one is getting married tomorrow. So I don't know if Kim Jong-un getting married tomorrow would make any difference, or the fish getting married. I don't know about fish marriage. I'm not an expert. Not what the master's degree is about, but right, that might change your perspective. So that is kind of how the game works. What I'm going to do to start us off is like I said, I'm just going to start with these sort of good and bad cards. I'm going to give you 2 good and 2 bad for each side. And then as a table, you'll need to discuss, right? Which one would you, and you don't necessarily have to decide together as a table, this is for sure what we're going to do, but maybe discuss if you had to, which side of the track you would feel the most comfortable, or I guess least terrible of running over. So I'm going to decide which cards go on which side, so they'll have to stay on that side. But I don't know what they are, so I'm not like rigging the game here necessarily. So once you get your cards, go ahead and flip them over and set them up along your track, and then start your discussion of what you would do if these were the actual circumstances of your trolley problem. All right, let's go ahead and bring it back together a little bit. So anyone can start, whoever feels like sharing first, but we don't need necessarily the particulars of yours unless that really made a sway, but just talk me through, what sort of made you decide, like, was there one kind of factor that was like, this was the card or this was the thing that we were thinking about, and that really changed my mind one way or the other? Anyone want to start?
Yeah. We could. So we had ultimately on one track, we had population for the entire country. And on the other track, the other biggest piece was the population of the building. So it was really a numbers game. Versus, so if you look like it was mentioned that the building could be 9/11, but an entire country. So it was really a numbers game.
Yeah. So you had no other cards were persuasive enough to go beyond just the numbers, right? Like there wasn't like someone who was so crazy that you're like, we have to kill them or we have to save them.
The caveat you added was to this side. So we still are not going to save these 13 kids, but we don't kill the entire population.
Yes. So for that particular track, it was really a numbers thing. Save, yes, yeah. Kill 1 to save 5. It's that sort of typical trolley problem. Awesome. All right. Who else? Yeah.
On one side, we had Mom, we've got the family, we've got Putin, and we've got the Kardashians on one side. Then on the other side, we have penguins going on vacation. We have all your financial records, all your financial debt. We've got a cult leader, and we have a farmer's market. So we're going to save Mom and the family, okay? Now the kicker she gave us was, the death of the cult leader and the penguins is going to collapse the global economy. Okay, but there's no time frame. Okay, you don't know. It says a chain of events that can go for 100 years. There's no time frame there. Okay, I'm sorry, penguins. It just is. The cult leader is a nut job. Okay, the farmers market may or may not even be open, so there may be nobody there. It doesn't say.
It doesn't say. That's true.
The financial records look different there. Just pay your bills, right? You gotta do what you gotta do. I'm sorry about your mom. Now, Mom, we assumed Mom and the family were all a normal functional family, right? We made them functional, happy, loving family, not abusive and dysfunctional. Because that could have changed things for some people. We realized that Putin and a cult leader, 6 of one, half a dozen of the other, right? Not much difference there. So the penguins and the cult leader, they gotta go.
That I think what's especially tricky is when you start getting in like, this is your mom or like a personal family member. That gets really tricky. I think that's like one of the first things where I'm like, that I'm inclined to save that side, whoever it is,
but
right?
Also was down to the numbers.
We got very lucky because this side could all be explained away as potentially nobody is being killed who's not actively harming another.
That's what we
Right.
did the numbers.
That's good. Yeah. So that's, and I think that's, yeah, part of it is part of it is definitely luck of the draw there.
And again, you have to acknowledge, not everybody has a good parent and good family. There are plenty of people who have had dysfunctional and horribly abusive. So I can see how somebody might, abusive mother, abusive family, who could go the other
Right.
way. I can see how, depending
Yeah.
on your frame of reference, you might leave the cult leader and the penguins alone.
The woman in the card does look really lovely and says, "I love you, honey." So we can, I think that's a fair assumption. Yes, that's a fair assumption. Yeah, that's okay. We got some counter arguments here. But so it sounds like, though, it ultimately came down really to a numbers game too, because there's potentially not, and the a collapse of the global economy. It also depends on your current maybe trust in the economy and whether it's currently collapsing or not either. So that's maybe part of it too. Interesting. Awesome. All right. Anyone else want to share? You guys want to go?
Yeah, we went against the numbers and against the family. Because we decided to hit like 70 million people. Because there's angry kid who's going to one day do a school shooting. The entire 1% who will one day save the world from climate change. Grandparents and 4 astronauts that are going to save the world from a massive meteor. We hit all of them in favor of the world's ugliest municipality, a traffic cop in the middle is giving you a ticket, a happy 3-legged dog, but the most important one is the scientist who's going to warn us of an impending disaster.
Well, because hypothetically, if that scientist is telling you about the impending disaster and it's the meteor that's coming to hit or something, right? Then you can maybe come up with a different solution. Yeah, we get it figured out. Interesting. Yeah, it's.
Because keep out of the shuttle's not on the tracks. The photo. Astronauts in the shuttle that's still in operation, but not on the tracks.
Interesting observation. I love that. Yes, I love that. I also like that you saved the dog. I've also found that animals are particularly persuasive for people, even if it's not the most persuasive. They're like, the dog's there though. Like that's something.
We also just we were unable to accept our modifier that the 1% would save the world for climate change.
That's
like, even for the sake of the game, we just didn't.
Yeah, that's fair. And you just don't have the modifier for the other side. It's possible that they would also potentially.
Yeah, maybe
Yes, they could be as well. Yes, and again, right, it's like one of those time frame things. Like, well, when are they going to do that? It's hard to say. Yeah, interesting. All right, do you guys like to share as well?
We originally were going to show off the world's greatest businesses, and these were full of the Roman Grannies, a lone scout, for a dangerous race of conquered aliens, and a sniper attempting to assassinate a local congressperson, in saving a promising young scientist, a park ranger helping an endangered species cross the tracks, a thief running to rob your home, and the person who hated both the night school. Due to a different kind of thief, like the scientist is looking like he's had his best days ahead of him.
Wow.
And the grannies sound like they have had their best days ahead of them, so we went with age.
Yeah, that's
Originally.
Yeah.
But the kicker was that the physicists would solve world hunger, the number in 3 years. So our basis was there's a number game of it. There's going to be more people saved by solving more hunger. And even if a lone scout is only a scout, general relativity would say by the time he went back to the civilization, he came back, everyone on the planet would not be there anymore.
So it's we can probably assume, especially right as scientists in the room that know space, like we know that's probably not going to happen. So we're probably good. It's interesting that some of the modifiers worked and some of them you're like, get that out of here. Some of them did not work. That's interesting. Yeah. And age, I think, is also another thing. That's something we're going to talk about today. A lot of we call it intergenerational justice. So thinking of future generations, thinking of age as something to consider when it comes to ethics, of sort of what kind of consideration we would put to age, which isn't always a factor, but could be a factor in some of the ways that we're thinking about about these things. Any other thoughts before we move on from this game of things where you're like, I was surprised by whatever, or I thought this way about this thing that I didn't think I would, think that way about it. All right. Well, we'll move on. I'll let you admire your cards a little bit longer. When we take a break, we'll bring them back up here. So let's go ahead and dive into some of the big questions in space ethics. I'm going to do just a really quick overview of some of the things that we might be thinking about in this sort of space ethics realm. And then we're going to dive into some medical ethics and get to our first example that we're going to have a very similar discussion, kind of like we just did, but not with a kind of bizarre Putin card. If anyone wants to see the picture that's on the Putin card, it's interesting. It'll be a little bit more sort of on this like hypothetical, what about a particular issue? So some of the big questions in space ethics that we think about, that it makes sense to not just think about scientifically, but ethically. And this is an important part of it is this difference between should and can. So a lot of times scientists are thinking about these same questions from a scientific perspective, but they're thinking, what can we do? Or can we do this? Can we do that? And they're trying to solve that sort of can problem. Like this is the engineering problem we have to solve. This is the physiological problem we have to solve. That's the sort of things that they're working on. But what space ethicists are thinking about are, should we do these things? Yes, we might solve some of those issues, but what are some of these other ethical complications? So some of the big questions include things like development in space. So either development in terms of developing a human civilization or development of things like mining infrastructure, so resource extraction in outer space. There's a lot of big questions with that because one, if you are creating a whole new civilization, a whole new group of people on Mars, on a space station, wherever, if you have a permanent settlement of people, that also means things like government and community, society. A lot of the same issues that we have here on Earth are just going to be copy and pasted right over to those civilizations, but with even more complications in that they would be very isolated. And so there's obviously a lot of tales about how you have isolated populations and ways things go wrong, right? Lord of the Flies, like random boys plopped on an island, right? And so there's a lot of ways in which fiction, literature, many TV shows, everything has talked about some of these issues. And because it's becoming more and more real that it's a possibility, it's really not science fiction anymore, or at least it might not be very soon. So talking about a lot of those big questions are important. Even if we are settling for things just like extraction and mining, we still have a lot of the same questions, not necessarily about societies as a whole, but even just as like the funding structure. So do governments mine and give the money back essentially to their people? Do companies mine? Who does the mining? Is it people? Is it robots? Who benefits from this and who is risking something in these endeavors? So even any kind of sort of development can have a lot of ethical questions, mostly that are translatable from Earth, but again, with a little bit more complications. We also have a question of space debris, which we will talk about in our final class of the series, talking a little bit more about what do we do about the amount of debris that we have in space now and could have in the future. This space is not the world's trash can, though I have watched a lot of WALL-E in the last month because my son is obsessed with the movie WALL-E. So it's very front of mind currently. But just thinking about how issues of debris can both hurt us now and into the future. So many of these questions being not just a one-time, let's solve whether we should go this way down the trolley or that way down the trolley, but really long-term issues. We also have a lot of potential disasters that could happen from space. So this is less into space exploration and more in just the ways that living in space, being a planet in space, can impact us and what we should be doing about it. So we can be impacted by an asteroid, we can be impacted by CME, so a coronal mass ejection that can disrupt our power and electric grid. There's issues with military in space, which is currently outlawed in international law, but without much teeth. So thinking about ways that we can better regulate space from here on Earth for all of these issues that are really global issues. So all of these questions, especially getting to like a kind of final big issue of extraterrestrial life, is none of these issues are a me or even like an us in this room or a United States or a North America problem. It's really the entire globe that we need to be thinking about these and figuring out some global solutions. So when we are talking about space ethics, the good news is we're working from a place that is fairly familiar, even though the frontier is very unfamiliar. But the reason ethicists are thinking about a lot of these issues is because they are still mostly ahead of us. So that means we're not playing catch up. And so this is a good time to be thinking about it. And it's also something that's probably happening soon and will definitely happen at some point, even if it's not in our lifetimes. Any of these issues are issues that could come up essentially at any time. So let's now start to get some of the language of, oh wait, let's see. So before I dive into that, so we asked the question at the beginning, why go to space? Why, or should we go to space or should we stay here mostly, right? The should we explore space, yes or no question. I have some reasons of why to go to space, but I'm curious from all of you, what are some of your thoughts about going to space? For those of you who are like, yes, we should explore space, what are some of the main drivers for you that was yes to that question? Yeah.
I would probably say like all unlimited resources, because that could generate money that could like help people directly.
So both the resources, which we could use the resources, and we could use the money. So it's sort of that twofold reason to go. Interesting. Yeah.
I don't see I just started a book with A City on Mars, so I don't think we're going to be able to get the resources that readily. It's the knowledge and the exploration and the benefits that we get from having to compress and make everything smaller. Okay, we now have cell phones. I'm old enough to remember when the first 4-function calculators came out, they were this big, right? Technology, because of the space program, because of the explanation of the exploration, has come so far. And now we've got all the world's knowledge in our cell phones. Yeah. Right? We can look up everything in Velcro, and there's so many things that we don't even realize that have come from the exploration and everything. So I think if it's more the knowledge, the advancements in technology that can benefit people.
Right. So it's not just a sort of looking into space, but also looking back at humanity, and it's benefit both ways. Yeah.
You're not going to do Mars.
Right.
I
Yeah.
don't see that going.
Yeah. But knowledge for sure. I mean, that's definitely something you can. Communication across space could work potentially. Yeah. Yeah. Interesting.
Knowledge too, but I come from a very religious perspective. It's the wonder that there's
Yeah.
a greater understanding of just existence and everything. I just think there's so much to see in the world and so much beauty that's bigger to give it.
So it's not even just like about the usefulness of it, but just like the knowledge in itself. Yeah, it has its own value. Yeah.
So I think it was said that it's kind of like our humans have a desire to go somewhere.
Yeah.
So maybe that in and of itself.
Yeah, it's like we're human. That's what we're meant to do, is to explore, and we've done the exploring here. That's how space is the final frontier, right? So going out into space. Yeah. Any other thoughts about reasons to go? Why we should go? Yeah.
Just like curiosity, kind of about like the universe as it exists, just kind of like understanding why things are the way that they are, like why speed of light is what it is, stuff like that.
Yeah.
Like I guess you don't need to go to space in order to do those things, but just observe it.
Yeah. So it's, the question of should we explore space is tricky, because one way to explore is to physically go, but we're also building bigger and bigger telescopes that can maybe answer this question. So it's sort of a twofold thing. Yeah.
I want to
we need to go to space because humanity will not be able to live on this planet forever because of climate change. And so figuring out how to colonize other extraterrestrial bodies is actually in humanity survival interests.
Yeah, that's a big Elon Musk claim for going to Mars, right? He's like, we've got all of our eggs in one basket, and we can move at least to another planet, and that might help us solve. I don't know, solve's probably too strong of a word, but we can move there to help kind of at least have two baskets potentially. Yeah.
Space rights. We need to get there first.
Yeah.
If we don't get there first, that might be.
Yeah. So going all the way back to like this idea of a space race hasn't really gone away. It just sort of died down for a bit and built back up. Yeah.
And back to her point, because like my thinking has been, well, we are going to destroy the Earth.
Yeah.
At some point, it's going to be uninhabitable. I believe, but not soon, but eventually.
Mm-hmm.
So, but then it would only be those. I think I heard somebody talk about the 1%. It would be them who would be going. Like it's kind of like the survival of the fittest. And so all those people that I would be, that I think about future generations, they're not going to make it to that other place.
Yeah.
Anyways. So,
It's tricky because you're like, yes, there it might be that it's uninhabitable here, but we're not looking like we're looking for like a fair and equitable move to Mars. It looks more like it's like the end of like Don't Look Up, and it's like all of them go, and I don't know if you guys saw the movie Don't Look Up, but then they like land on this other planet, and then the animals there start eating all of the 1%ers that made it there. So it was at the end, you're like, okay, this is working out, not for actually anyone in humanity, but like good for those animals for getting their new food or whatever. Yeah, definitely interesting. Yeah.
I don't see human nature changing if we even go to Mars and make it habitable. And Mars is really uninhabitable, right? So even if we get there and make it habitable, okay, so we loot another planet, right? We're gonna abuse it the same way we've abused this one. We're not gonna suddenly improve our thinking and be generous to each other and start bringing lots of people. No, we're just gonna rape another planet and do the same thing.
Another issue with that thought is that kind of operates from that perspective of the most important thing is the never-ending earthly survival of humans.
Yeah.
Ask the question like, are we supposed to indefinitely exist?
Yeah.
Maybe not.
Yeah.
Dinosaurs didn't.
Yeah.
Stuff happened.
I also definitely don't agree with the idea that like we should just, because we made a mess here, we should just leave. Because like we all learned as kids that like you make a mess, you clean it up, right? And that should probably apply as grown-ups as well.
Oh yeah, it should. It really should. That's the.
We keep polluting the planet. We keep, doing things and abusing the parks and killing the pollinators and everything else. So we're not going to change if we go to a different planet. I don't see that. But it's also just the evolution of Earth. Not necessarily that humans are destroying the Earth. We are, but there's also just the natural evolution of heat, cold, all that. And unless we make great strides in science to be able to survive that for everyone, it's a problem.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Well, let's get a couple other voices in here. Yeah.
Yeah, so I worked on the Appalachian Trail for 2 years. I have a lot of experience in environmental, like science, environmentalism. I've been hands-on. We're not doomed, and the climate pessimism really, really ticks me off. Yeah, because there's a lot going wrong in our Earth. There's a lot we can fix, but it's all happened in such a short span, of humanity. You think about it, within the last 200. I don't know.
Since the Industrial Revolution, essentially.
I swung a pickaxe at rocks, okay, and then I looked and saw how nature is resilient. I don't believe that humans don't change. I'm sorry, that's your opinion, that's your belief, that's fine. I have seen that humans can change. I've witnessed it myself. And I think this like doomerism that we've all subscribed to, that we're screwed and it doesn't matter, nothing matters, that really, really, really irritates me. I'm sorry. Like I just have to get that out there.
Let's get one more thought, and then we'll circle back because we're going to talk about environmental ethics more, and we'll have some language to talk about why we should be hopeful, right, and where that can help us think about space ethics too. Yeah.
Yeah, I was going to bring up wisdom. It's like concrete example.
Mm-hmm.
So we were able to work on that, make great strides in that, in no small part because we have satellites and lower orbit doing all this modern science for us.
Yeah, so we know that we can see an issue come together, especially we talk about the sort of developed and developing world, because of the developed world basically creating all the issues. They had to solve that one, and they, for the most part, did. And so I think that that's the good news, is there's examples of ways that we've done better. When I was in school, that was like the big example, like we did it, and I'm like waiting for the next example to come up, but it hasn't yet. But I think that's a good example of, and why, if we go back to right, which slide was it? Yeah, thinking about all these issues, like these are real global issues that we're going to have to solve kind of all together. Okay, so we'll definitely circle back to some of the environmental stuff, because that, I think, just directly leads into talking about answering some of these questions of why we should go to space, or ways that we can think about that. So you mentioned most of the things on my list here. So we do have a limited time on Earth, but not necessarily in a doomsday kind of way, in a like, the sun will eventually expand in billions of years. So there is, I mean, in some ways that's almost an optimistic perspective of like, we're going to be around for billions of years. Do I believe that? Not necessarily. But I think it's possible, certainly, right? And so if we are, then eventually we'd have to do something else. So there is this eventual limitation. We also know that space exploration can bring new technology. We mentioned that. And I think this last point is particularly important because it's what connects us together, I think, in a way beyond necessarily needing to want to extract minerals or want to escape the planet, which is a sort of escapism, is typically what we hear. This human spirit demanding to explore, I think, is sort of the most noble version of this. I don't think it is the one that most of the people exploring space are thinking about or putting like first on their agenda, but I do think they talk about it first on their agenda so that they can appeal to the rest of us. And I don't think they're wrong about that either, right? That there is something that makes us want to explore. And I think that's why then we talk about, if we want to explore, what does that look like? Does that mean getting in a spaceship and going? Or like we talked about, getting a bigger telescope, right, to answer some of these questions. What does that actually look like? So other people, of course, are like, is it worth the risk? And I do want to talk a little bit about some of the reasons why we had some voters that were like, I am a little more hesitant to go. We can definitely talk about that too. I just want to make sure we can get through a little bit more of the conversation. But is it worth the risk to go? There's definitely some people who are not necessarily super gung-ho to explore space, and for some good reasons. So space exploration, of course, is very risky. We have a long history of space disasters and space successes, but it's not an easy thing. You mentioned Mars, terrible place to live, right? And we still want to send people there. So we know it's not easy. It's definitely hard. It costs a lot of money, and so there's a lot of trade-offs there with the amount of money we spend. There's also some potential for backwards contamination. If we send people to space, they can bring microbes back. That's something we've been thinking about for a long time, so that scientific question of like, can we prevent this? Certainly scientists are thinking about that, but we also don't know what we don't know. So there's that issue. And then this final, like, last question that I alluded to earlier is, should we do this when we're thinking about future generations? And there's the kind of two different camps, right? Like, if you have this sort of escapism thought, then it is for future generations that we might go and inhabit Mars, inhabit a space station. going back to WALL-E, being in that big spaceship where everyone's in those fancy chairs and like drinking their lunch or whatever. Like maybe that is for future generations to preserve humanity, or maybe it's not in the interest of future generations, because we would have to figure out how to do things like reproduce in space, which we don't know if that's safe, and we can't really test it on Earth because it's impossible to create the conditions here on Earth, right? So reproducing in space or sending embryos like frozen. I have a niece who was born from an embryo who was frozen. She's older than her brother, though she's 5 years younger than her brother, right? So we know that there's some technologies that exist with freezing embryos. That might be a sort of solution, right, to this future generations, but we also have an issue of things like informed consent. Like these embryos did not consent to being formed in the first place, nor being thrown and throttled through space. So there are some issues where a lot of these are like, they could go either way, but they are things to consider when we talk about going to space. So this last one is very important, of course, this is not fine, and of, you know, being on Earth. It really puts us in a sort of existential problem here, an existential position. And I can tell that a lot of people have thought about this a lot, right? This existential position of what do we do in the face of disaster? And whether it's global disasters, our own disasters in our own lives, which we sometimes have, right? We're constantly thinking about these things, and figuring out how to approach them is really, really important, right? That's why it's important to have these kinds of conversations. Okay. So what I want us to do, since we've been chatting for a little bit, we'll go ahead and take a break, and then we're going to come back. We're going to use, we're going to go through a couple different perspectives from medical ethics and environmental ethics, and get to some examples, have some more conversations about what to do in some of these scenarios. All right, let's go ahead and take a break and grab more water, coffee, feel free to chat. And restroom is right down the hall if you guys need it. All right, we'll go ahead and get restarted. So for the rest of the class, what we're going to do is, like I said, I'm introducing some thoughts and principles from medical ethics and environmental ethics. And so I'll introduce some medical ethics concepts. We'll have a discussion on some space ethics issues that can use those concepts. And then we'll dive into some environmental ethics concepts and use that to discuss some space ethics. So that's going to be kind of our next two sections. And I chose medical ethics and environmental ethics because I felt like those translate pretty well. I didn't necessarily use like the top theories or anything like that, just to give you a little bit of an idea of the ways that people are thinking about this, right? Like I don't have to tell you what ethics is, like you already have a general idea of the ways that you're thinking about it. And this is just introducing, again, some more principles and concepts, just so you can sort of think about this from some other perspectives too, see where some other people may be coming from when talking about these issues. So with medical ethics, we're going to start with some pretty standard principles. So these are a little bit more kind of old school principles, ways that we've thought about medicine for a long time, all the way back to like the Hippocratic Oath. So thinking of like do no harm. And these first two of our four principles are autonomy and parentalism or paternalism. So these two principles are really two sides of the same coin. On the one hand, we have autonomy or self-governance. So I get to make my own decisions for myself. Typically, we think of everyone having a basic level of autonomy. This is really important in medicine for things like informed consent, so that you can be making the right decisions about your own health, following your own values when you're making those kinds of decisions. And this is really strongly held, especially in the United States. And then, you know, there's times where as patients in medicine, we lose autonomy for one reason or another. And so that's when we have parentalism. Now, the tricky thing of why it's two sides of one coin is sometimes you're spinning like a top, right? You're not autonomous, or you are maybe not conscious right now, but you will be. And so then it's not just making decisions for someone who will never be autonomous again, but it's really tricky to decide, is this person have a certain level of autonomy in decision making or not. Another good example are folks with dementia, right? They kind of go in and out of being lucid, and so really knowing where this line of this person should be making 100% their decisions for themselves is really, really hard, which is why we talk about it in ethics, right? If it was just like, oh, well, this person has autonomy, this one doesn't, that would be clear cut. Medicine would have it figured out. We wouldn't have to worry about it. But it's just not like that. So then when we think about parentalism or paternalism, we want to be thinking about these sort of basic tenets of what we should be considering for the person who doesn't fully have their autonomy. So thinking about their welfare, goodness, happiness, their needs, their interests, their values, and we can help make those decisions for them, whether that's loved ones, but also sometimes doctors, right? We trust doctors to help us with our issues. We didn't go to school for cancer or cardiac issues or whatever it is. And so we're trusting because we can't necessarily be fully autonomous without all the information that our doctor gives us. They can help us make some of these decisions too. Now, the way that this translates into space ethics is we are almost never autonomous in the ways in which space ethics is happening around us, right? We're not making the decision of whether to launch this rocket, that rocket. We are not making funding decisions for NASA unless someone in the room is someone I didn't realize was here. I don't know, right? But for the most part, these decisions are being made for us on our behalf. And so there's, of course, ways that we can be involved in that, right? Like voting for people who you think would fund this NASA mission or whatever, lobbying to Congress, calling your congressperson, whatever. Like there are ways to do this. You can buy a Tesla if you really want, Elon to do something, or you can, be an Amazon subscriber if you want Jeff Bezos to do something, right? You can do all of these things hypothetically in your little tiny ways, but for the most part, these decisions are happening on our behalf. And so what our job can be is to figure out what our welfare, good, happiness, needs, interests, values are. And if we can figure out what those are for ourselves, for our society, that can help potentially those people make the right decisions again on our behalf. Not that it's easy or that it's direct or that it's something that we have a ton of control over, but there is this certain level of turning ourselves over to these powers that be that are making these decisions for us. And understanding that what they should be doing is parentalism, again, taking our own needs into consideration and not just sort of doing things without consideration for us. And that's kind of the hope. Some other moral principles that hopefully would help in that kind of guiding decision are things like utility and justice. Now, we've already talked a little bit about utility. The principle of utility is what a lot of us said in the trolley problem, which is it's a numbers game, making sure the most people benefit. Now, many of you in your trolley situations, you weren't in that trolley. There is a card in here that's like you, and it's like, because then you're like self-preservation. I don't know. This sick kid also looks really needy, but I also want to live. So we weren't necessarily making that decision about ourselves, but we were thinking about it in terms of, we were probably for the most part in that winning camp, right? Because most of us probably didn't find ourselves on that losing side of the trolley. So that includes us, but also everyone else, making sure that decisions are helping the most amount of people. This is really tricky in space ethics because sometimes we don't agree on what is helping and what is hurting, on what we should or shouldn't do. So it's not necessarily just a numbers game in the way that we sometimes can make it simple with the trolley problem, because you're like, well, all these people are dead. And, there's certain level of explanation, right? We're like justifying, like, okay, this doesn't seem right. Or back here, they're like, well, this space shuttle isn't on the track, so that's going to be preserved over here on the side. It's just the people, and so other people can drive this shuttle, right? So there was certain justifications there, but it felt a lot more clear cut than what actual reality is. And so having the conversations of what is the good of humanity, the good of society, those are big questions. Those are big philosophical questions, and it takes a lot of conversation to figure that out. Yeah.
and a utilitarian argument.
Yes. Yes. So it's not so, yeah, it's a numbers game in the consequences as well. So making sure that the impact, the consequences benefits the most number of people. Like, I mean, like we said, ethics is not like a fun game. It's not like we've saved everyone, right? Like that's ideal. That's just not how life is. And so, we have risks. We know we have these sort of bad things that are going to happen. And especially when we talk about space, like I cannot emphasize enough how terrible space is compared to Earth. And yet many of us in this room were like, let's go, right? I mean, that's how many of us are, thinking about this. Is it's so important for one reason or another that we do this exploration in some way, that we're willing to take on those risks. And that's a we in the sort of big W sense, right? Not just like us in this room, but we as humanity. And so it's really important that thinking about utility, we're thinking about this in this sort of broader sense. And then justice, I have two bullet points under justice because it's really important in two different ways. One is the point you made earlier, right? Of this space exploration thing isn't really equitable as it stands right now. Space exploration benefits really the people in power. The hope is that there's some trickle down in the benefits, and certainly that has been the case with the space rate. We all use Velcro. Like we are set with Velcro. We also all use satellite internet, right? We all, well, maybe not all of us, but like we use all of these things that came from the space race. So there is some equity that we've seen in the past that we can only hope would trickle down into this. But that needs to really, for most people in the space ethics game, be a big part of that, making sure that anytime we're mining things like let's go, let's mine, okay, where's that money going? Is it going to feed people here on Earth? Or is it going to be like a fourth mansion for Jeff Bezos? Like, I don't know. And that's probably important.
Yeah. I would argue that if you're going to make like a long-term space settlement, it has to be equitable, because the 1%, like they can't just go there and do all of themselves. Like they need electricians and waiters and doctors and everyone else to support them, right? So I would argue that utility would kind of like naturally follow if we like pursue this.
Or at least we would hope that we'd have to solve that problem, right? We couldn't ignore it, that's for certain, right? Is we would have to figure out what that would look like. Hopefully the doctors, the electricians, everyone's well paid, they get to take part in that success too. Like that is really the hope. And if it's not, then we know from history, right, if it's inequitable, that there's consequences to that, right? There's revolution, there's all these things. Every sci-fi movie ever, right, about the uprising of whomever, right? Like, so we know that that's going to happen at some point. Yeah. Exactly. Well, and that's, I think the good news is we have some, stuff to learn from, right? And so it is this big question of, are we going to learn? Are we not? And that's a huge mystery, which makes it, I think, scary because you're like, please, hopefully we'll do better, but there's no promise that we will, right? And but I think that's what's so nice is we do have this like long learning experience, and especially a lot of the people right now who are wanting to explore space, their whole businesses are built on the backs of people who are doing all the hard labor. And so we know that they can't do it without us, right? Us in terms of the 99%. And they also have to know that they can't do it without us, and hopefully in an equitable way. But that is a question that would have to be answered, right? At some point, they would have to confront that. So that is the good news. There is that open door for fairness in terms of justice. Now, the other part of this, the people getting what is their due, is also holding people accountable. So it's fairness is a part of that, of like we all need to make sure we're a part of this. But if someone does something wrong, holding them accountable, that's a huge question mark still, right? We try to do things like with our buying power, holding people accountable, or by voting people out of office for not being accountable. We're trying to do those kinds of things here, and that's kind of what we can do. But in this global we, capital W, and our global institutions, it's really tricky. But that is going to be important because bad actors can definitely throw us off course, right? We know that we can do it well. The question is we, or are we going to do this well? And so that's kind of where that justice fits in. So those are some basic principles from medical ethics that we can pull over. These are not necessarily like just for medical ethics, right? They're in general for ethics, but some of the ways that we think about them with medical ethics can also help us in thinking about space ethics. And then thinking from a more softer side, the ethics of care is another way of thinking about ethics that sort of grew out of feminist ethics and medical ethics, of thinking about the person not just as someone who is ethical by following a bunch of rules, universal rules that we set up, to where, okay, well, this is what fairness is, and so I have to be fair in this way, this way, this way, or I have to make sure justice is enacted in this way, this way, this way. And instead thinking of an ethics of care as relational. So thinking about people being the sort of individuals, yes, they have autonomy, but they also have specific needs. They have desires, they have values. They're religious, they're not religious, whatever. And because of those reasons, they might have very particular feelings and thoughts about, for medical ethics, their medical care, right? So some people are like my dad has always told me, and because he's ridiculous, he's like, if I ever get dementia, push me in front of a bus. And I'm like, I mean, I'm not going to push you in front of a bus, but he feels very strongly he doesn't want to go through that experience, right? And that's because of his experience, that's because of his values. So all of us are coming at a place of, especially in medicine, with those values with us. It's not necessarily baggage in a bad sense, but it's inevitable because we're human, right? We're people. And so because of that, when we talk about ethics of care in medicine, it's about making sure that the ethical decisions you're making is toward your patient as a person, and not just based on some kind of rule that tells you how to act to your patients. And so this really came out of medicine because we saw, and any of you that have had really bad experiences with a doctor before, or with the sort of medical profession at some point, you know what it's like to be treated poorly. And they're like, yeah, technically they followed all the rules, but I felt terrible leaving that visit because of the way they talked to me or whatever, right? They didn't put my care first. And so what this does is it really helps point towards relationships and the responsibilities that arise from that. That people, not everyone is going to relate to you ethically in the same way. And that's okay. Like, we're not all just like in someone's trolley problem, right? Which, you know, you could talk about us being just, you know, little game pieces on a board, but really we're all different people. We all have different relationships with different people. And so we should all have and think about ethics in a more complex one-on-one kind of way. And in space ethics, I think this can help us to remember that the people that we're sending into space, or the people that are making these decisions, us ourselves, we're all those very complex human people. And we have these sort of relationships that help both define us and give us a kind of meaning and extra responsibility in the way that we're thinking about this. So if we're sending an astronaut to space, one of the ways we've done this well recently is by giving them a better space toilet, right? Like for Apollo missions, they were like, what, you're going to be up there, what, like, I don't know, a few days, like pooping this, right? Like they were just like, good luck, right? They didn't like, it's not that they didn't care. It was a race, right? They were like, we have to get to space as quickly as possible. You can urinate in this thing, like we'll make it work, right? And it was a very like, we got to do this, go, go, go. But realistically, if we're sending people to space, we don't want to send them with like, you know, bagged lunches and be like, good luck, right? We're like, what does it mean to be a person? And all of us have talked a lot about like, this is important to me, right, as a person. And if you were that astronaut going and they were like, astronaut 571, and you just like were a number, not a person, you're going to wear this suit, which we developed for just this kind of person, right? Like that's not quite the experience you would want if you're an astronaut, presumably, right? Because you are a person, not just a random astronaut on a spaceship. And you're going to have a lot more of very specific needs. And especially if we're sending anything else more complex, right? Not just sending astronauts to stay on the moon for a couple of days, but to actually create a whole society. It's not just about making sure they can survive, but making sure that they can really live and live well. And that, I think, is a really important part that ethics of care can talk, you know, teach us a little bit about with space ethics, is thinking about people just not as numbers, but really as, if we're going to do this, let's really do this in a way that makes it meaningful. in all the decisions that we're making. All right, so let's talk about an example then of how this could come into play. So one of the space-related threats out there are asteroids. You can also talk about CMEs or coronal mass ejections if you'd like. But in your groups at your tables, I just want you to think through what should we do to be the most prepared, right? Making the ethical decision for being prepared for a potential space disaster here on Earth. What do you think is our ethical responsibility to get ready? So again, not what can we do, right? That's the science question. What should we do? What level of responsibility in the big W sense do we have to humanity to protect ourselves from these particular threats? All right. Break. Discuss. We'll take it just like 3-ish minutes to discuss. All right, because we are almost out of time, I'm going to skip us sharing back this time just because I want to be able to talk about a couple more concepts in environmental ethics. I'm going to skip one that I had. So with environmental ethics, I think there's an even more clear connection. I want to just talk about sustainability really briefly. I'm going to skip to my next slide. But sustainability, this really goes back to that other question of living well. When we're thinking about space exploration, it's not just about living, but living well. And so part of that is needing to create new systems and better systems that are really fair, equitable, and sustainable, and make sure that we're thinking about intergenerational justice, right? Making sure that the quality of life that we have, if we find it acceptable or whatever that level of quality of life is, that that's available to future generations, both here on Earth and hypothetically in space, if we're doing that. Now, one of the ways that we can sort of ensure this, and this is two real important principles to try to figure out in environmental ethics, is intrinsic value and extrinsic, or in this case, instrumental value. And so intrinsic value is a value of something in its own right. So almost everyone agrees across ethics that people, we have intrinsic value. Little babies have intrinsic value, all the way up to someone on their deathbed has intrinsic value, right? We all have intrinsic value because we're human, and because of all the things that we've talked about here today, right? Our values, the things that we hold dear, our autonomy, we have intrinsic value. We also have instrumental value. So like, we're all, I am, because, Dr. West had to go to Florida, I'm feeding his guinea pigs, like that's my instrumental value for him. Like, so good for him and his guinea pigs. But I also, value him intrinsically. He values me intrinsically, right? Beyond just the fact that I feed his guinea pigs when he's gone. So we value each other both ways, but it gets really tricky when we start talking about other things that are not human, right? Whether other planets on their own have intrinsic value. Do this alien civilization out there have intrinsic value? Do certain institutions have intrinsic value, or ways of thinking in themselves have intrinsic value? Like anything that is non-human gets really tricky to figure out if it is valuable, if we do give it intrinsic value, how we then need to treat it based on our ethical intuition and any other ethical principles we have. Because the idea is, in environmental ethics, things that have intrinsic value basically have the highest level of value that we can consider. A lot of people, a good example of this is with animals and animal rights. So speaking from a vegetarian, I feel very strongly about animals, but honestly not like that much. Like I don't eat them, but I also kind of get why other people do. It's like built in our institutions, right? And I find them extra special. But I would say like maybe my pet is even more valuable to me than like a random chicken. I'm not going to eat that chicken, but I also probably don't care about it as much as like my pet snake, right? So that's the sort of spectrum that we're thinking about. So even within intrinsic value, you can value something intrinsically, like I might value my snake intrinsically, but that doesn't mean that that snake necessarily has intrinsic value of its own, or maybe it does, right? That's a kind of question that we're still trying to solve in environmental ethics, but I think it gets even trickier when you have more things to value, right? Space is a lot more stuff, literally, than Earth. And so that just adds another layer of dimension to this intrinsic and extrinsic question. So I'm going to leave this last question up for us to discuss basically at your leisure. You can discuss it walking out the door if you'd like. I know some of us probably have places to be. You're also welcome to sit and discuss for these last few minutes if you'd like as well. But thinking about our whole discussion today, so thinking about our ethical principles, ethics of care, thinking about sustainability and intrinsic and extrinsic value, I have one final thing to just sort of think about, and that is how we should consider commercial interests in space. Should we be putting any kind of limitations on the interests of corporations in space? And what does that look like compared to our own individual interests? How do we balance that? Are institutions intrinsically valuable in themselves? Are they not? And how would that be kind of weighed against it? This is something that, regardless of the ways that you value it, it's definitely going to be an important question to answer, because this is literally happening basically as we speak, right? You can think of how many satellites are being shot up into outer space now for satellite internet. We have at least tens, if not hundreds of thousands more satellites going around the planet within the next, dozen years or so planned. So lots happening in space that need to be considered, and thinking about our own interests as well. And this is a really big question, right? Because it's the big WE versus actual corporations doing this work, and then all of us as individuals too. All right, let me see. That's one. Yeah. I'm going to skip back to that so you can always discuss that towards the end. But really quick before we go, I'm just curious. I'm not going to ask for you to raise your hand again exactly, but has anyone's thoughts changed? Not necessarily switch sides or anything, but changed after some of our discussions tonight on this question of should we explore space, yes or no? I'm just curious. Interesting.
I think it's been expanded.
Yeah. No, that's good. Awesome. Well, I will keep this question up. Feel free to stay and discuss this if you'd like. Otherwise, thank you for joining me for class tonight. I don't want to hold you here too long, so enjoy the rest of your evening if you'd like to go. Otherwise, you're welcome to kind of stay and chat, and I'll stick around for a little while for any discussion. Awesome. Absolutely.